Welcome to the Water People podcast. I'm Lauren Hill, and my co-host is Dave Rastovich. This episode is presented in partnership with Who Gives a Crap. They deliver recycled TP to your doorstep and donate half of their profits to help build toilets and improve sanitation for those in need. Today, we're in conversation with homesteading surfer, filmmaker, and entrepreneur Cyrus Sutton, known best for his skill across diverse wavecrafts and his creative reflections of surf culture via movies like Riding Waves, Under the Sun, and Stoked and Broke. Cyrus is also the founder of Corduroy.tv and Manda Organic Skincare. Our podcast comes to you from the coastal land and waters of both the Bundjalung and Gubbi Gubbi nations. We'd like to acknowledge these traditional custodians and pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'd also like to extend that respect to all First Nations people this podcast ripples out toward. Welcome to the first episode of Season 3 of the Water People podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our very fortunate conversations with great people. Hopefully you can hear the frogs and some of the birds that are singing in the winter sun. And we're sitting here after having a few wonderful conversations with people, but in particular this time with Cyrus Sutton.
Yeah, Cyrus has inspired me in so many ways through film and through his writings and photography. He is just a really beautiful mirror for our culture, for our surfing culture, and I think a fantastic representation of someone who is diving in deeply and daring to ask big questions about complex issues in our world.
Well, I actually think back to Cyrus's first well-known surfing movie that he made, and he may have done stuff before this one, but Riding Waves was the one that he created a long time ago now. I'm not sure what year it was, but Dane Reynolds, who's, one of surfing's amazing, most high-performance surfers, was just a kid then, playing video games and basketball in his parents' front yard and stuff, and he was in Riding Waves. So was Donovan Frankenreiter, and he had this psychedelic Portaloo sequence that Cyrus had made out of all these trippy animations and different stuff. And then also there was John Peck in there, and that was unheard of at that time, and still kind of is actually, to have multi-generational people and very different types of surfing and esoteric stuff from John. Is still one of my most favourite surf sequences in the world.
Can you give a little bit of context about who John Peck is? Because we mentioned him a couple of times in the conversation, and maybe some people aren't familiar with his contributions to the culture.
Okay, so John Peck is an elder in the surfing culture who was hanging out in the same area as Cyrus in Encinitas area in Southern California. And so I guess their paths crossed, and then over the years he and John and myself and Garth Murphy, who was kind of like this conduit character in surfing who just knows pretty much everyone, certainly anyone interesting. And so anyway, those paths have all intermingled. But John Peck's story is a very deep and wide story that I couldn't possibly summarize in a short way. But he was one of the early surfers from California who was experimenting and trying to ride the waves on the North Shore at a time where Hawaii had just gone through massive upheaval and colonization, and there was very few surfers in the water. There are still Hawaiian surfers around, but breaks like Pipeline and Sunset Beach on the North Shore were very quiet, and certainly Pipeline. And John was, along with Butch Van Aertsdale, and one of the real standout white fella Harley surfers from California, to ride pipe successfully on those old sluggish longboards,
which is an incredible
really
feat
difficult
when you think about how difficult they are to maneuver.
Exactly, and how John rode that wave is still how people ride it to this day. So he rode it on his backhand, grabbing his rail, taking off late, and doing what we call a pig dog move to slip through the heaviest part of the wave. And so it's just classic that he did that so long ago. This is like the 60s. And so he was also a extreme character in that he was willing to really experiment with his lifestyle and philosophies. And so at that point in time, the psychedelics revolution was happening in California. Timothy Leary was there, and John was right in the middle of it all. He was going to Jimi Hendrix concerts where they were giving out acid at the front door for people to have a great night, and he's just got so many stories.
We don't have to get into it too much, because I think we're going to have an extended conversation with John later this season.
But John was like this central character who was in the real undercurrents and the very subversive elements of surfing back in that period, and has gone through some very dark times and delivered himself through that into basically like a yogic lifestyle. He is such a yogi of surfing and yoga and spiritual inquiry. And so for Cyrus to include John, who would miraculously appear on every good day of surf in Southern California, he was so onto it and so embedded in the ecology there that he was like this mystical character that people would always laugh about, how on the best day at Swami's or the best day at Trestles or the best day anywhere along that coast, he would just be there. And so very, very mystical kind of guy. And so first, Cyrus to include him in a film with young, hotshot California surfers like Dane Reynolds and Donovan Frankenreiter was just really bold. And it just spoke to the fact that Cyrus had his interests and he thought they were valid and worth sharing with the rest of us, and they are, and they have been, and every project he's done since then has been of that kind of nature, very inclusive, very creative, very refreshing, and very honest. In periods of surfing's sort of mainstream, wannabe mainstream capitalist, colonialist sort of eras, from the 90s till now, was a pretty radical time for people just wanting to make money out of surfing, kids getting sponsored, before they're 10 years old, getting fed into the industry, and a lot of people coming to surfing, a lot of people wanting to take from surfing. And Cyrus has always had a different angle to that.
I feel like he brings the artistry to our culture in many ways, the reflective, the introspective. He reminds us of the play and the joy of it. And you can see how someone like John Peck would resonate with Cyrus when you hear a little bit more about his story in our conversation, how he's had to weather some tumultuous times as well and has been delivered through that, alongside his surfing life.
Also, one thing that's really interesting is that he spent a lot of time with John Peck and Garth Murphy, sort of esoteric elders in the surfing tribe. And one of their contemporaries back in the day was Timothy Leary, who spoke of surfers as throwerheads in time, that, it's a sign of a potentially good culture if you have people surfing.
Yeah.
And
I always want to ask about that. Do you feel like that's true? I see people hold up that quote really, quite frequently as indicative of surfers as, visionaries in some way, just because they ride waves.
I think it was a tweaked version of what the Hawaiians were able to attain in Hawaii, where they had such an amazing food system, such an amazing cultural structure, and such connection to country and to their home lands and waters that they had enough time to go surfing.
Yeah.
And they had the Makahiki Festival, and they had created such abundance and sort of symmetry and just beautiful balance there that they could go surfing for all those times.
I wonder if Timothy Leary knew that, though.
Yeah, so I think his view is a very American-centric, very Californian industrial sort of point of view in response to the military and industrial complex that was America at that point, right? They just come out of the Second World War. California was a military beast of making, like so many surfers were from, like Bob Simmons was an aeronautics engineer creating airplanes. So many surfers were embedded, like so much of our technology and the things we use, like wetsuits and surf forecasting, all comes from the military there. So he had a different perspective because of the world he was living in. But The way I think of Cyrus as a throw-ahead is that he is part of the Southern Californian phenomena of growing up in semi-small coastal communities that are now completely concreted over and paved over and overpopulated and stressed, and living in a very stressed system where water's coming in for Southern California from other states. There is all kinds of air pollution, water pollution issues there, like you can't surf there if it's rained heavily for days afterwards. So, and then also a lot of the waves are very, very busy. And when you speak with Cyrus, he's up north. He left all of that. He left his home surf spots, his home community, his family to go north. And so the reason I think of that throw-ahead line is because for us living in another part of the world where we haven't gotten to that overdeveloped type of environment where we can still surf when the rain is pouring, thankfully, because we get a lot of rain here.
Yeah.
So I think of Cyrus as a bit of a throw-ahead. It's like, oh, he can teach a lot of us how he has navigated that situation, how it feels, and he's articulate enough to talk about it in ways that are very enlightening and inspiring, because he's still got a great spark in his voice and in his life. He's very passionate. He still loves surfing, but he's had to adapt.
Yeah, the Throwaheads quote from Timothy Leary, for me, kind of brings out a little bit of my jadedness. It makes me kind of want to roll my eyes in some ways and just go, oh my gosh, you should see our industry. You should see what our surfboards are made out of. You should see the waste that's created, social and environmental, from our culture around the world as we've sort of taken the colonialist spirit with us to mine waves and pave over cultures. But at the same time, it also inspires conversation for me, that quote. It inspires, it just makes me want to ask, like, okay, are we throwaheads? And how can we do better? How can we make this culture of ours more regenerative? And that's what Cyrus has done so beautifully. His curiosity is fascinating to me, and I think is leading us, I don't know, at least me in particular. I love reading his writings and watching his films, in particular Under the Sun, which was this really potent juxtaposition of surf culture, competitive, sort of hyper-masculine surf culture on the Gold Coast in comparison to a more free and easy kind of Byron surf culture that came out quite a few years ago now. You were a part of that project. And it didn't get seen by many people because of distribution issues. But I just love the way Cyrus leads through creative curiosity and delving into big questions. And right now, he's on land in Washington, really asking big questions about the day-to-day, how we make a home, how we build our homes and our lives, and how we learn to take surfing to the land, how we take the pattern literacy that we have cultivated in a surfing life and how we bring that to our everyday terrestrial lives.
Yeah. His other one that's really fantastic that gives us a lot of thought is Stoked and Broke. And that's a really fun but also very just enlightening piece that he made with Ryan Birch, where it's just, you got to just watch it. Stoked and Broke, just go and watch it. It's a short-ish project, but it just says so much. And I think surfing's very much better off for someone like Cyrus being among us and creating, and hopefully being way up north where it's cold and the surf's quite hidden and whatever, and he's a bit away from the coast. I hope we don't lose him to the country. I think surfing's much better off for having him, and hopefully that'll continue.
So we start every episode by asking our guests about a time or experience after which they were never the same. And I was wondering if you have a time like that you'd be willing to share, Cyrus.
Wow. Something that comes to mind is remember when we were in northern Sumatra, Dave, and the camera, my little 16 millimeter ex-military camera housing flooded by getting hit by that wave. And
Yes, I remember that vividly.
And that was after all my 16 gear had been stolen twice, once out of the back of your van and then once in a rental car in Australia. And I think that that run of events kind of helped me find another gear. I think I've always been kind of tenacious and, going after things. But I think it was at that moment, I think I was pretty young when I was like 23 or something, 24. And I think if I would have kept drilling down on life, I would have probably burnt out a long time ago. But, you're on a boat with your heroes and trying to make this film funded by a record company. And there was no place to hide other than to surrender, and to learn that at that age when, before I'd really encountered any major trials or tribulations in life. Like, yeah, it was a good lesson in surrender.
So that, for people who are listening, the story there, which you started at with that wave coming literally out of the deep blue channel and just peaking up and landing straight in the boat on your head and Swilly's head and drowning your gear and everything.
Like the tinny or
in the little runabout, the Foxy Lady off the Mango. And so that, was at the end of a run that was just so outrageous in terms of challenge after challenge after challenge, and your perseverance and your adhering to a vision, like a goal, a vision, an outcome, whatever you'd like to call it. But what was really admirable with that was that you were willing to keep turning up as someone from the outside watching you in that moment. That was also a time where, there was, I don't know, unfinished business in your world that it felt like you had to take care of. Can you give us a little bit of an insight into what was happening around that time, beyond just those crazy events of gear stolen and gear flooded and challenge?
Yeah, like are you talking about like within the movie, or just like in the bigger context of like the previous film, or?
Well, just who you were at that point, because you were such a young dude who had already created Riding Waves, which still has probably my most favorite surf sequence of all time, with John Peck and Swamis, and just, our shared history with that guy. And you were just, you came out of nowhere with such vision and skill. And yeah, I just feel like it's just an interesting period there, where it's like, what was motivating you at that time to continue pushing through layers and to continue learning new skills and to continue when you were really faced with some serious challenges?
Yeah. Well, I think it all started with this weird something from somewhere else. I don't know where, but it was this incredible feeling of stoke that I've yet to rekindle. But I remember when I was like 17, 18, and I'd found filmmaking and photography, that I grew up in suburban Orange County, where I kind of thought everything came from a store, like everything you need, and the wilderness was the ocean. And then to be able to, I grew up in a family of artists, and I kind of pulled away from it because it felt a little contrived, or it's just, you don't want to do what your parents do, I guess. And but like to find this spirit moving through of creativity, and not having really a lot of access to that in school. There weren't a lot of art programs, and it was just this hit of wow, I can be creative and I can channel something greater than myself, and I can combine this love I've had for surfing, because surfing is the wilderness, down there. It's all concrete and strip malls, and then there's the ocean. And I remember just really having trouble sleeping because of excitement and wanting to learn every little thing about filmmaking and watching. It wasn't like YouTube was around, so I would get VHSs of Michel Gondry and all these different music video makers that strung together their music videos of claymation and just ways of communicating a feeling. And I was also really into creative writing. I was in creative writing camps when I was a kid, and I didn't really have a bridge. I kind of died off when I found surfing. So I think, filmmaking was a way to communicate and storytell in a way that I felt like could really, be of service to questions that I was dealing with. And at that time, I'd gotten really blessed, and that I got to work with amazing surfers in California, and kind of got my heart broken in the process after riding waves, of working with a surfer and somebody who I really looked up to, and it just kind of fell apart because of business stuff that I wasn't prepared or had really no knowledge about handling. And I think Under the Sun was sort of my quest, that I came to you, and we'd met a couple of years prior for that next wave, after the tsunami film. And I wanted to make a film that sort of dispelled the sort of illusory nature of the surf industry marketing thing, so that kids could just see it for what it was, and also to try to pull out the beauty that I still really felt for surfing. So I was driven to sort of, make a creative, positive spin on things that had really hurt personally.
Well, I know at that time, and it's interesting now, isn't it, when we look at the fluctuations of what the surfing organism is, and especially the industry, and the peak and the troughs of it all. And that at that point, it was just so such a beast, and so wasteful, and so much marketing around everything, and commodifying of everything. And I remember just feeling so enthusiastic about you and your work, because you were also, doing a project that was coming from backing from a record company, Ubiquity. And it just all felt so great to have someone like yourself wanting to peel back some layers and do a bit of a warts and all, but a very creative warts and all look at this beast that we're all a part of. When you look at that time and that project, so Under the Sun, the film and the soundtrack and all this amazing work you put into that, how do you feel about it now when you look back, when you look at that time and what you made? What do you feel?
Well, I mean, you guys made an incredible soundtrack, and I really was excited to work with you, because you were a surfer who, your image was being marketed, but you had this, I loved the way that you dealt with all of it. You could just laugh at it and have fun. And I think that energy has really sort of influenced a lot of, what surfing is today. I mean, now it's everybody's, just, there's almost an admission that surfing it's just fun, and let's have fun and let's spread stoke. And if we're, being paid to travel around and go to places we're not from, like, at least we can be ambassadors of the joy that the ocean gives us. And I think at that time, there was a lot of seriousness around surfing. It was like, so thanks for sharing that in the film. And I think that looking back, it was just a big learning lesson. Like I taught myself how to animate during that film, and I felt like that was going to uni, like that was my own. And I felt that with film ever since, is that I've never gone to college or university, and it's always been this window into working with people and sort of picking a major, picking a curriculum, and, studying with teachers who don't have a course in academia. And it was just interesting to see and spend time with a lot of well-known Australian surfers, old and young, and to just kind of see where people were at in their lives and how they dealt with that. It definitely sort of informed how I wanted to interact with surfing moving forward, and what opportunities existed within surfing.
And how did you want to interact with surfing moving forward? Because then you went back to California, and you went back to Southern California, which, is such a beast of a place with so much industry and some pretty tweaky elements to it, where, they got the whole population of Australia basically in Southern California right there, and a very finite amount of waves. And then you were in that little pocket down there at the Derby House, hanging out with Birch and Garth and John Peck, probably some of the most left field humans who surf on the planet, all just in that little bubble. and then, you know, you came along to something like the Stoked and Broke project. Like, what was your headspace at that point in relation to surfing? Because to me, that both of those projects, Stoked and Broke and Under the Sun, are real. You know, Lauren was just saying last night how much of a mirror you are for areas of the surfing organism. And
yeah, I just feel like before we get into that kind of meandering question, I wanted to ask about the release and distribution of Under the Sun, because when I saw it, I think on a DVD that you had in your like little sweet
digital
DVD.
video disc technology. I still use those.
I just thought it was the most thoughtful reflections on modern surf culture that I'd seen. I mean, optimistic and beautiful, of course, but just thoughtful and such a mirror. And your films have continued to do that, to reflect back the complex web of surfing culture today. And yeah, I was interested to know why more people probably didn't get to see Under the Sun. Was there an issue with distribution or something that kind of blocked it for a while?
Yeah, so my financier of the project, with his wife, they funded it, and right before the release kind of had a messy divorce and fought over the rights for, I think it was 18 months or 2 years. So it just sort of sat there, and it was it was a tough time, but you know, it got out there, and then I came and toured in Australia. But yeah, it never really got seen, and because of that, and back to your other question, Dave, of like, I wanted to also prove myself, I think maybe to my family, who were pretty artistic, and at least my mom had, you know, been accomplished in that kind of world. And I think that was the film where I was like, all right, I did something that I'm really proud of, and it didn't pan out to where really people saw it, but I'm happy inside. And then after that, I started Corduroy, and it was, I kind of had given, and that, and like having all this, the stolen camera gear, it just, I think that there's a side that always knocks on our door of like motivation for self, like status or wealth or grandeur or anything like that. Like, I think I was kind of ambitious and wanted to make a name for myself, and that few years, 7 years, really beat it out of me to the point where I came back to California and San Diego, and I was like, all right, well, how can I help? Because anytime I try to do something for me, it doesn't really work out. And, you know, how can I be of service? And then things just started to flow. And it seems cyclical like that in my life. And I think a lot of our lives, where we get humbled by life, and then we just go, okay, well, I'm alive. the grass is green, you know, the fruit is here, and life is beautiful. There's beautiful people, and you know, how can I help? And then we can kind of get sidetracked, or and kind of be like, all right, well, I really want to do this because I want to have this. And that was definitely a time that was Under the Sun was like at the end of that, where I was like, all right, I'm just going to help. And I remember I had a dream one time and I woke up from it, and I honestly, you guys have been to the Derby, and I think it's haunted by really good ghosts.
Yeah,
because I had some crazy dreams down there, and one of them was like, I just woke up with a clear realization that if I had an idea or something that I thought would be really good to do, but that maybe somebody else could do it better, that I really shouldn't tell them, and that I should like work on it myself. And then, you know, that's the culture of a competitive place. And then I remember waking up from this dream, like, what if you just told the person, just called them up, even if you haven't talked to them for a year, you barely know them, and just like give them the idea. And so I started doing that, and all of a sudden I had, you know, there were like 5 people working on Corduroy, and we were making all these videos and doing all this stuff, and then everything started working out, you know. So
wow, I can totally back up your good ghost thing there with that house, which is, you know, one of the oldest, for people listening, it's one of the oldest, if not the oldest house in that Encinitas area. And I remember one of the first times I was there, I was still doing Silent Tuesdays and not eating every Tuesday. And I spent the day with John Peck in the house there. We went for a little surf and then came back and then did some yoga and then played music for like 6 hours or something straight, just the two of us in the main room there near all the books and the piano. And when I finally opened my eyes after just hours of playing music silently with John, or not silently, without speaking. And then when I opened my eyes, all I saw were just basically like light shapes everywhere in the room. Like you'd call them angels, I guess, but just light shapes. And he and I just sort of nodded to each other, walked off, and then went to bed. And the next morning when we woke up, I went straight to him like, John, brother John, how was that musical, whatever you want to call it? And he's, yeah, brother Dave, they were with us. They were all with us. And we were just in another dimension, like 100% another dimension. And I often think about that space and also the amazing guidance of someone like Garth and those people in your life. How have you felt about, having mentors and having intergenerational relationships like that with people? And were those guys much of an influence on you and your work and your period in time there?
Yeah, well, for people who don't know who Garth Murphy is, I always talk about him like he's the highly intelligent Forrest Gump of surfing in terms of his
that's totally true. He's been everywhere at every time in surfing's history. He has. He's been like, you're so on the money. That's exactly. Everyone here still talks about Garth and periods in time when he was on the North Coast here.
Yeah, I mean, it was wild because Pat Curran would drive out from the Rockies and stay in the yard and camp out next to me, or
wow.
Derek Hind and Jack would come and hang out, or you would come, or Jerry Lopez, or whatever. It was Morris Cole would drop by, and
wow.
It was quite a space. And he has just always, he's a very gentle soul, and he really loves simple things in life and quiet moments. And I think he really he just wants to nurture light, and he understands the world is increasingly complex, and his fenced in acre is sort of a little Eden in the middle of an increasingly fast paced. It seems like the Derby houses, it just seemed like it time stood still there. There was photos up on the wall of when people would just ride their horses down to the beach from the Derby house, which was the stable. And yeah, I've been really, really blessed to, for some reason, I always find older mentors, and they're incredibly generous in not only showing me skills, but just offering a space for me to stay and kind of shelter myself from the wind of society. So I am eternally grateful to Garth, and there's been many Garths in my life.
I watched a beautiful short you made about your artisan academic mom, and she talks about her craft and working with fibers and sculpting, and it speaks so beautifully about nets being of the first technology of our species. And I felt like hearing from your mom gave me such an insight to your roots in tangible work, in the work of using your hands to make and to build. And that's part of what's been so fascinating for me to witness, little glimpses of your journey, is just how willing you are to give things a go, to use your own resources and your own hands to build things when they don't exist, like rickshaws, making up a rickshaw to cart a surfboard down a very unlikely stretch of highway in the, one of the most densely populated stretches of coastline. Yeah, I don't really have a question, but I just felt like that was such an insight into that seed that was planted maybe early on about the possibility of the work of just putting your head down and using your hands.
Yeah, I mean, my mom, she's an incredible woman, and it's something I just keep appreciating more and more as I get older. And, when you're a kid, it's just your mom. And then, her work it's incredible. I mean, she gave up so much when she had me to have a solid job to put food on the table. And she's really sacrificed so much. And yeah, thanks for mentioning her on here. She really deserves a lot of credit for what she's done and how many young people she's helped out in her teaching and inspired. And it's embarrassing that I've only made one little video on her, and I've spent so much time learning from other people. That's something I should look at.
Well, that short definitely made me want to learn more. She seems like an incredible artist, and yeah, just with so much wisdom to share. And you can see that ripple on through your work and the way that you bring that handcrafted aspect to all of your projects.
Thank you.
Cyrus, I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper into what you were just mentioning earlier, where you said you've been really fortunate to, find older mentors, and that keeps happening. And I can relate to that, because for me, I was very fortunate as a young fella when my family were sort of on the ropes and lots of crazy stuff was happening with my dad, that I basically stumbled across Dick Van Stralen and another older lifeguard friend, Rod Morgan, who took me under their wing as a little cocky little snot-nosed little 14-year-old at Burley Heads. And I have so much to be grateful for those guys and what they did for me. And so I was really thinking then how great it would be for other young and old listeners to hear how you've managed to be shoulder to shoulder with some of these amazing older mentors, and how they might seek that out and benefit from the very natural intergenerational relationship of mentoring and feeling like you're a real humble student with someone who's very experienced. How do you feel you can cultivate that in your life, and perhaps how have you done it specifically?
I've never thought about that. What do you think it was for you that allowed that to happen?
Okay, I see what you're doing here, buddy. You're buying yourself some time, and that's cool. I don't want to hear from me. I want to hear from you. But I'll play this game. And well, I think a lot of the times openings are created, and or holes even perhaps are created in our the landscape of our life, and we can fill those spaces with all kinds of things. But it's really wonderful if we either live in a community or a part of a culture, say in our situation, surfing culture, or now growing food and garden culture and whatnot. But if we have those opportunities in a moment that might feel like you're in the trenches or in a bit of a hole, we have an opportunity to reach out to someone. And you can look in that direction and go, ooh, that person there is quite renowned in this area. Or, oh, that one person I met at the beach that day just seemed really vibrant, and maybe I'll just go have a cup of tea and go hang out with them and see what comes from it. And so there's almost like a necessary step that we have to take, a little vulnerable step forward to someone like that. And for me as a kid, I was fortunate with Dick Van Stralen living in the local area of where I was. It was easy to take that step and go hang out. Or another one for me was Albie Falzon, who lived down the coast near to some friends on a big permaculture farm. And so when, like I said, when my dad was having a really rough time in life, my family was sort of breaking apart, that was a bit of a hole that was created. And I realized that I did need an uncle of sorts, or a second father figure, or someone at that time to hang out with. And so a little step forward for me was really helpful. Has that been something you can relate to when you think of those characters in your life?
Yeah, I think that, in our society, the lack of intergenerational living and the sort of just breaking up of the family unit has created a lot of problems, but also opportunities for us to connect with people who, really align with what we're passionate about. And I think that having something to share, and like for me, it was making films. It was a way to, not. I think Garth also wanted to support my art, but they saw that I was really passionate about storytelling, and it was like a window. It was a hall pass into a school with somebody, and it was a way to spend time. And some people have been, have opened themselves up to me because I spent a lot of time with them trying to see their life through fresh eyes and capture it in that way, and that there was like this reciprocal relationship there. I think that in some cases, like with Garth, there's just certain people who just pick up on somebody's energy, and they want to help out. I think that I recently mentored a young man for over a year, and he kind of mentored me as well. It's wild how reciprocal it was. But there's been times, what I've learned is I've done it well, and I've done it and not so well. Like I've done it where I felt like I took more than I gave, and so I think that what I've learned is, everything in life is a reciprocal relationship, and there's some people who, are helping you, but that it's really important to, even as a young person, realize that, when you get older, and I feel like we're all sitting here in kind of the middle part of our lives, so we can see both sides. We can remember being kids, and we can also kind of vision into what it's going to be like, when we're looking back and having to already let go of certain things in youth. And I think that, yeah, older people in our Western societies are oftentimes lonely and alienated, and have so much experience and wisdom, and just being an ear and listening to stories and providing physical help that they might not have the energy to do. Or I think that that's actually a really beautiful opportunity right now for people to, especially as like income inequality is rising and access to land, and we're getting into farming conversations, and there's a lot of people with land who are older and who have canvases that they've stewarded. And I think it's a great question, and it's a very burdened one. There's a lot in that of seeking mentorship, and also community through that, what each kind of side is missing. There's a lot of guidance that's missing for young people. There's a lot of turmoil right now, and feeling that things aren't okay, and people not trusting what is, and institutions and things like that. And I think young people more than ever are looking for a compass, North Star,
There's also a lot of feeling like we're in completely unprecedented times. And when I start to feel like that, it always drives me back to sit at the feet of my mentors or elders, just to ask questions about, like, have you been through something like this before? Like, what have you experienced in your life that you can draw parallel to what's happening in the world right now? And it feels so reassuring to know that, maybe this exact situation hasn't played out, but something similar would have transpired over the course of human history that can empower us and inspire us, and to help us walk more gracefully through our own sort of times and unique challenges. Yeah, so it's really nice to hear that it's something that you're thinking about too, that intergenerational deep relationship that we've sort of lost in so many ways. We've lost the value for connecting both to older and to younger. I'm finding, like you're saying, moving into the middle of life now, it's so exciting to connect with younger women in particular, and just to keep their youthful energy, and then having the balance of someone wise and experienced like Helena Norberg Hodge, who's a real mentor for me. It feels like we're kind of transitioning. The crux of one of the questions that I wanted to really ask you, Cyrus, is about why you headed north, how you were established as a professional surfer and a filmmaker and an entrepreneur and creative, and really had all of these tendrils wound out into surf culture. And it feels like you kind of hit the road in a lot of ways. And I was interested to know what inspired you to leave your homelands and your home waters in Southern California and look for something else.
It all comes back to dreams at the Derby. I had this reoccurring nightmare that there was like no food and water and that things were going to get crazy there at some point. And it just felt, I didn't really leave because of, just because of fear. But the short answer is I came up here and it felt like home more than anywhere I'd been in America. And I was shooting Island Earth at the time and learning about water and hydrology, and just, this felt like a temperate Hawaii, and just the air. And it really felt like I'd been here before. I'd spent a long time and already, or this was a major piece of life. And I lucked into being able to buy one of my good friends' family's house. I was able to, save up enough money for the down payment by living in my van and not paying rent for 12 years. And it was just it wasn't on the market. I got a deal and it worked out. Here I am. And half the days I'm like, what am I doing here? And the other half I'm always grateful, but it's a big departure.
Is it coastal?
No, it's 2 hours from the coast to the closest spot, and it's 2.5 to a lot of them. And yeah, I don't surf a ton, especially with pigs and goats and chickens and all the animal critters I got to keep alive. And
I can't help but ask if the decision to move to such a different way of life was reactionary in any way. Like, was there any jadedness with your experiences in particular industries that made you want to do a 180 away from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I think I had heard from Garth actually that you had some health stuff, Dave, about just from traveling and picking up bugs while you're on the road. Some gut stuff. And like, I was getting the same thing. I was getting sick all the time because I was going to, Kamchatka, Russia and Cuba, and a lot of different being exposed to a lot of different microbiomes. And I think that combined with sort of learning about the roots of Hawaiian surfing culture and how they sort of set up their agricultural systems to provide enough leisure time to do art and surf, I just sort of felt less and less interested in going to places that I'm not from with the camera and espousing, this dream of finding a perfect wave or something. And I, more about it than I do. I didn't do it obviously as long as you have. And I really looked up to that lifestyle. And, obviously you're one of my heroes, and being able to spend time with you and a number of other surfers, it was something I gravitated to. And then even though, we talked about it pretty frankly and under the sun and discussed it and the roots, it's fun. It's super fun to travel, and it's really an amazing exchange. But I didn't feel like that was really a hell yes. It was sort of, it felt a little weird every time. And so I just always wanted to find home, and I think that being able to go surf and travel is an incredible blessing, and it's an amazing expression of joy that the world really needs. And I just personally wanted to, I felt spread really thin for a long time between everything I was doing, and that joy that I was getting from surfing was giving me so much stoke, but I was just constantly pouring it out into the world, that I wanted to kind of just ebb a little bit. I need to take a break from, like, the swells come in, and then we wait for the next set, and I think that's kind of where I'm in right now. It's just like more of an integrating process of trying to make sense of the world and really grow my skill set, before, telling new stories or anything like that.
So do you feel like if there was a little less humanity in Southern California and you were able to be on a piece of land where you can have non-human time and then you could go surfing, would that be something that you would have chosen? Was it just...
Or was the pullback from the expression of surfing an important part of the retreat for you too?
I love surfing. I love surfing so much. To be honest, I just really couldn't afford a nice spot in Southern California. It had gotten so unattainable and dry. I think my mom's down in Ojai near Santa Barbara, and I think they got 3 inches of rain this winter. And
Wow.
it's just really changing very quickly, and yeah, unattainable. So I just kind of wanted to go somewhere close enough where I could still drive 14 hours south and see my mom, and she can come up here and see my friends, but be in a place that's a little more stabilized with biomass.
And so that being the case, and you having now a fancy fiber optic cable delivering you access both ways to the intraweb, what's your relationship with that space like then? Because, when we first started talking, you were running around looking for stuff in your tech space there that you didn't know where things were, and it sounded like you've been probably in the gardens and working on other things more than tapping on a keyboard. How does this world that we're now speaking through fit into your daily life up there?
Yeah, I created a little studio to do, projects. Really what I'm doing is I found a beautiful partner, and she and I are both, on property, and we're just trying to fix it up so that we can rent out her house. She can move out here, or we can farm and cut our living expenses down to the point where we don't have to work that much. It's kind of back to me living in a van. It's why I, lived in a van for so long, was because I could keep my overhead low enough to be an artist. And so I think we're just trying to make things simple enough to where I can get back to doing things that I really want to do. And I'm fortunate enough to have clients that I have steady work with as well, that I can, pay the bills. But that's sort of the race right now, is to get both of our properties fixed up so that we can get a bit of rent, and then dive back into corduroy. I'm relaunching pretty soon. We've spent a year redoing the website and curating it. And so I'd love to just do that again and not really think about the nuts and bolts of living and money and survival and all that stuff. And that's pretty close. So it's exciting to
Wow, awesome.
sort of gap up.
What's the motivation with that? Why would you want to dive back into that and doing the corduroy work?
I think, my whole family's teachers. And so I've just grown up with sharing and really loving being engaged. And I question that. It's funny. I question that today. Like, I'm going deeper and deeper into the community here, and I'm thinking about how nurturing, a decentralized sort of website, would impact my ability to be a good partner, or a good father to the animals, and good neighbor, and all those things. And I just got to find the balance there. But I do like that community. That is probably the same reason you guys are doing Water People. It's like it can get isolating being where you are, and having an excuse to get on the phone and chat with somebody and create a podcast, or in my case, create an article or a video. It's just fun. I mean, I hope when we get corduroy up, we can do something fun together. And it's just, yeah, it seems like a nice balance between 21st century tech and, low tech, how it's always been.
Do you ever feel an obligation to surfing, if you look at surfing as an entity that gives us so much, and this is just the experience of harmonizing and riding a water wave in the ocean here? I'm not talking about other humans, the industry, or any of the other fluff around the edges. It's just that experience at the core of it. Do you ever feel like that, corduroy and some of these things, it's just the way we're doing this podcast, or the way you do your corduroy work in other films, that it almost is just like, man, I got to do something with all this good juju that I got from that last session, or from that thought of, a sunrise in the water or whatever. Is that ever anything that bubbles up in your mind?
That's beautiful. Yeah, I think, surfing is something that it's almost too good to be true, right? It's something that gives us a feeling that is, especially being away from it for a while now. I've surfed maybe 3 times in the last year because I've been so head down on the property. And when I have gotten to surf, it's like, wow, this definitely shaped who I am. There's no mistake. And I think that what I'm doing right now is trying to take that surfing energy to the land. And I want to invite surfers, as I'm sure you guys are too, like back to like, how do we surf the soil? How do we surf the seasons? How do we surf with animals, and how do we become proactive stewards on our land and not just fit within this preservation conservation ethic that isn't working? And how do we take that flowiness and that intuition and that pattern literacy back into creating sustainable and regenerative lifestyles that are going to allow our kids to really have fun waves to ride?
Apologies for interrupting the conversation, but we'd like to take a moment to recognize the generous folks who help make this podcast possible. 2 billion people around the world live without access to a toilet. That means lots of people head to their local beach or riverbank to do their business, which, when you're talking about 2 billion poos or more a day, doesn't make for healthy waterways or communities.
My explorations in activism over the years made me feel like I had to be either leading campaigns or taking part in radical initiatives of some sort to be doing something in the world. Though now, especially at this time where many of us are staying home and localising, it feels really important to look at our daily decisions, and you don't get more daily than making a dirt. And that's where Who Gives a Crap comes in. They are a B Corp that believes that access to a toilet is a basic human right, and they donate 50% of profits to providing proper sanitation to those in need. And that, to me, feels like a great form of everyday activism.
27,000 trees are cut down every day to make toilet paper. We support Who Gives a Crap because they make toilet paper from recycled textbooks or bamboo and plastic-free packaging, so we all have a better option than chopping down trees to wipe our bums. We can all make a difference with as little as our toilet paper budget. Head to whogivesacrap.org and use the coupon code WATERPeople to get $10 off your first subscription. That's $10 off your first subscription purchase at whogivesacrap.org with coupon code WATERPeople.
Thanks to Gary McNeil Concepts, who put together cosmic boards for cosmic people. Gaz's boards combine recycled and plant-based materials that are built to last without sacrificing performance. To learn more, head to GaryMcNeilConcepts.com.
I love the way you write. I know for Dave, social media and Instagram is all very contentious and not preferred space. But one of the reasons why I still engage in that space is because of people like you who write so thoughtfully about intersectionality, the intersectionalities between Indigenous wisdom and environmentalism and surf culture and storytelling. You've written a fair bit about the roots of the modern environmental movement, and I'd love to hear you speak or elaborate on that a little bit more.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm fired up about this. Is the stuff that I really get excited about right now. And I think that, it's basically we're living in sort of a post John Muir industrial revolutionary mindset around the environment, which was founded by people who had financially greatly benefited by the mechanization of the industrializing of all of our basic systems, and that they sort of saw nature as this respite from the deleterious ways of mankind, which they just sort of lumped mankind into being something that was pernicious or negative on the land. And a lot of our laws locally want to protect nature from us and want to kind of make it into a petting zoo, and have really caused the rift in America and allowed for, the negative urban versus rural conflicts that we have, and the rise of people like Donald Trump, and the rise of super leftist globalism that is also problematic in its own way. I mean, anything in an extreme. And so I'm just really fascinated with where that came from, how that proliferates, and then how we can heal that divide and realize that for 98% of our earthly tenure on Earth, like, we've been a net positive to net neutral force on the land. And we're like any other animal, although we have certain gifts that can be incredibly extractive if disconnected and in a colonialist construct, or they can be incredibly healing. And I'm fascinated with colonialism right now, not because of the negative context that it has around certain racial groups which have benefited or been adversely affected by it in the last 200 to 300 years, but more about what the actual definition of it is, and the fact that I love studying like macroeconomics and looking at the rise and fall of empires and seeing how, and you were talking about elders and history and talking to elders and researching, it's like we've been here before, and every empire falls, and their sort of satellite empires, Commonwealth nations, etc., fall when they consume more than they produce at a local level. And if it's as simple as that, if we're not literate in our bioregion as to food, medicine, shelter, we're not able to really sustain ourselves. And I think it's getting back to, it's not doing it like one man is an island, right? And sort of going against this, like the systems and eschewing globalization and the interconnectivity and the information that we have. I think it's really looking at, where are we getting the basics that sustain us? And I think a lot of the environmental movement was birthed from a comfy place within a construct in which we take for granted where things come from. And then you have the conservative movement going, yeah, well, all your shit comes from another place. And then when you throw it away, it goes somewhere else. So that NIMBYism isn't actually serving. And that NIMBYism has created, NIMBYism acronym for not in my backyard, like, has taken our jobs, And so how can we start producing and gleaning resources from the lands around us in a way that is done with a level of literacy that creates, in the case of the West, Donald Trump in the last debates said, you have to clear your forest, you have to scrape your forest. That's why the wildfires are happening in response to climate change. And, it was the one thing he said, it was like, he's not wrong. We need to actually proactively manage the lands around us and not see them as a petting zoo, and learn about the power of pigs and goats and different animals, and learn about, peak diameter size or optimum diameter size of large species trees, and what's too crowded, what's going to burn and take out the whole thing, and how do we harvest timber in between the trees and not clear cut, and how do we use technologies to create a climax ecosystem. And we just haven't had that literacy. And so the last 30, 40 years especially have been around sort of just going backwards and saying no, and ironically just doing worse stuff overseas and weakening ourselves and our culture, because I think culture is created when there is an inherent necessity of surviving on what surrounds us. And when we don't have that, then there's a million wormholes that we can go down, young people can go down, in terms of finding identity, which they're not bad, they're not good, they're just they take power away from individuals, and that power can be usurped by people that don't have our best interests at heart.
Cyrus, it's great to hear the energy levels in your voice ramp right up when you started talking about this, and I can totally agree. We feel very much the same, and I'm wondering, have you read much of Wendell Berry's writing?
You know, I have it on the bookshelf, and that is something that I really want to start reading, but I haven't.
Holy moly, you're in for it.
What do you recommend? What should I start with?
All of them. Probably one of the best book titles I've ever read is one that I just read of his. That the title is "What Are People For?" It's just the best title. But the one I'm holding in my hand is "Bringing It to the Table," and it's on farming and food. And one of the things I've pretty much scribbled over every page and circled most paragraphs in the book. But one that comes to mind when you're speaking of what you're talking about with wilderness and domesticity and all these things we've made up. But here he says, the dualism of domestic and wild is after all mostly false, and it is misleading. He says, the world, we may say, is wild, and all the creatures are homemakers within it, practicing domesticity, mating, raising young, seeking food and comfort. And he cannot stand the term environmentalism or environmentalist. If someone calls him that, he's a farmer, and he just doesn't draw that line in his mind and separate spaces out. And it makes me think of our space here. Just before we had our little boy, I had been doing a lot of play in the soil here and spending a lot of time on the land between surfing and whatnot. And we got to a point where we were eating so much from this space and able to have, each meal of the day from here, our water from the roof, all these amazing relationships with these plants and the space here. And I was struck. It was like I got just sideswiped by this feeling of success. And it was so interesting after having a very, very fortunate life of travel and adventures and what you would think is success in modern terms in the Western world. But none of that really felt as deep and as timeless and real as the feeling of sustaining and being sustained by this space here that we inhabit, the biosphere of our local area, like you're talking about. And it was just a really defining moment in my life. And I wonder, for you at this point in time, have you had those moments with your chooks or your goats or your pigs or that space there where something's just clicked and you've had that kind of that feeling?
Oh, it's so cool to hear that from you. Yeah, all the time. There are harder times than I've had, because as you know, none of this stuff's easy, or oftentimes not as fun as just going surfing. But yeah, there's just like, I don't know, I feel like we watch these romantic movies, right, where like they create this story arc of having romantic feelings about something, but seeing an animal grow and be stronger on the land, and knowing that you took care of it through a time when it couldn't survive, or seeing plants do that and then give you fruit, and then knowing that you're more and more of a place. I think it's something that we all long for, and that we don't quite know. Some of us don't quite know that we're longing for that, and it took me a while to understand, and that's really all I was ever searching for, was belonging.
I love that a lot of your work and the things that you do are a type of conversation. It's like you're talking with the surfing organism industry or culture or individual surfers, and you're having these back and forths. And Wendell Berry, he writes about how our sort of right relationship with country, with land, with ecology is a conversation. There has to be a back and forth, and we've been experiencing that on our space here that we look after, of trying to do one thing and not being great listeners and pushing a bit too much, and then all of a sudden there's a pushback of sorts, and that is a conversation with this space here. And anyway, that just came to mind when I heard you talking about watching those creatures, those plants, talk back to you and say thanks in a way.
It reminds me of some of the language in permaculture about how many living beings in the forest and elsewhere are gardeners, like we are. They dig and they forage and they prune and perform many of the same functions that we do when we take the time to get our hands back involved with the land. I was wondering how much thought systems like permaculture or other sort of organized modern incarnations of approaches to being with the land have influenced the way you're doing things on your land.
Yeah, definitely like yourselves. Jeff Lawton's very clear and concise oration of permaculture and earthworks in particular, really just the way he was able to describe it and show it in practice in Jordan and just around the world, it has really influenced me. And then just people I've met along the way, a lot of the people in Hawaii that I got to work with, sort of their animistic and spiritual understanding of the land and the way that they talked about it, much in the same way that you just described, Dave, in this conversational way. And I'm really a student. I'm learning right now. I'm trying to understand in this bioregion in what zone, or for people that aren't like super permies, it's like how close to the house I'm doing different things. And I don't know, I think a lot of gardening and farming is, there's Rudolf Steiner and biodynamics and all of that cosmic farming stuff. And then there's just intensive vegetable gardening, and then there's food forests, and then there's, all these different ways of hugel beds and, hugel culture. And I don't really know which ones work best at what times for what. And I think that I'm just kind of interested in integrating all of those. The thing that I'm really interested in right now is something that I don't feel has been adequately addressed, is land access. And I'm just kind of on a personal project. I don't know if I'll share it in an organized form or just teach it here on the land, or just continue to be a student of it, or if it will influence my decisions in life, is sort of like the legalities, economics, and interpersonal dynamics of co-ownership and cohabitation of land. And I think that those three things are really paramount to frameworks within permaculture, that they're talked about, but it's also, just people getting on land and trying shit is what we need right now, right? I feel like more people, if we can understand as a culture what skills we're missing, if we know what we don't know, and because it's complex, right? Like, I feel like I am completely a baby here. Like, I did not grow up with this level of literacy around fixing things and building and farming, and it's all so there's so many skill sets to learn, and having people on your team and weighing their wisdom economically in terms of owning together and understanding, and not trying not to repeat the pitfalls of the failed commune and why people couldn't stick together, and learning from that. And and land ownership being something that really is, being called into question here, and looking at like how we, work so hard and then create a commodified dynamic around land, and then how that alienates people that can come on and actually really help. And is that what we want? So that's a big question that I'm leaning into and interviewing and trying to understand in my own life.
I heard that you became unemployed for the first time in your adult life last year. What was that experience like?
I had a full-time job. I I'm co-founder of Monda, the sunscreen company that's like food grade organic sunscreen, and then I don't know, a number of other projects. And yeah, at the beginning of COVID, I got laid off from my full-time job and was basically, for the first time in a long time, like income wasn't steady. So I don't think it's something that I can like talk about and say, oh, it was hard or whatever, because I've been blessed and there's plenty of opportunity. And at that time I was kind of scared, because of just what was happening last spring or fall for you guys down there. And it just seemed like, whoa, what's going on? But yeah, it's been a good opportunity for me to slow down, realize that in my pursuit of stability and in my pursuit of, I don't know, as we come into like childbearing, rearing age, it seems like, for me at least, like the money has become something which it never really was. And so I've kind of been like, all right, I got to hustle and think about the future and do all these things. And to have COVID happen and feeling like I took a step back in the middle of my productive years was something that was a bit of an existential angst. But it's taught me that there is a lot there between the pace of that I was doing and a lot that I really needed to actually slow down. And I think a lot of us feel that way at this point. And I've talked to a lot of people around here, and I don't know, how you guys are doing or faring with all this stuff, but it seems like, when you're really passionate about something, that there are no shortage of opportunities, and we get used to those. But when those get stripped away, we find that the abundance is just always there in different forms. How are you feeling these days with everything and being out there? Is everything like feeling pretty groovy and chill? Or are you guys kind of like hustling around? Or
Well, it's a really dynamic period. It's super changeable. Like here in Australia, there's all kinds of fluctuations of where people are leaving urban centres and going to, some of the rural and regional areas, and or just picking up and bringing a sort of metropolitan mindset to country areas, and the friction that comes from that, from local people. And, those sort of dynamics are interesting. And then
which calls into question for me, and I wanted to ask you this, Cyrus, you're someone like myself who has moved from one place to another place and made your home, and so wondering, how do we inhabit a new place without bringing a colonialist mindset, without carrying that hangover of ignore. I mean, I guess it's pretty obvious, ignoring the place that you're living and comparing to the place you were. And I guess just drawing in what Dave was saying, like when we have conversations with people who have moved from the city into the country, how do we have that conversation around why where they've moved to is different than where they've come from, in a sweet and sensitive way that welcomes them into new mindsets and paces, like you were talking about?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, and it's something I think about all the time. And I think for me, colonialism is an energy. It often expresses itself as excitement, like, oh, I found this new thing, like I'm gonna dive into it, or potentially bad connotation of that feeling would be like exploit it. And I think it's just, for me, what I've learned and what I've observed in being colonialist with surfing adventures, mining waves, and what they, the beauty that they represent for a product or a set of products, a line of products, and it just seems like there is, like, none of us want to suffer, right? None of us want to feel like we don't belong, and none of us want to feel like we're at the bottom of the food chain. But I think that not being colonial, like, just takes that. It just takes being like an acknowledgement that we have a lot to learn and things aren't going to go as easily as we think, and that we really hold our moving to a place as a potential to be of service to that place, and that service requires self-education. And it hasn't been easy for me. It's been a challenge in the sense that things just happen a lot more slowly when you are starting from scratch in a place. And especially since I'm not near the coast, and the jobs that are available around here, I'm not a logger, I'm not a carpenter. I didn't grow up with carpenter parents or these things that make life a lot easier. I don't have my extended family around me, so yeah, I think we have to also, for people who are making the leap to go somewhere else, I think we also have to have empathy for them, like immigrants and things who are, we can look at, I think it's funny, we have different connotations for immigrants and then we do like people who are from, the city coming out to the country. But I think the more that country living becomes, I mean, I don't know if Elon Musk's link is coming down to Australia, it's being talked about, but in North America, it's going to provide fast internet for all of rural America in the next year. And, we're going to see a big influx outside of cities. And I'm sure it's going to happen in Australia soon as well. And, it cuts both ways where I found that like territorialism around surfing also really interesting as well, of how people are really hard on new people who move in, and there are limited resources. But I think it's for those of us who develop a skill set and a comfort and a relationship with a place, it's important for us to determine how our relationship, when it becomes right and it becomes in line, we want more people, right? We want to have there be an influx of human capital and energy to share in. I think that's the test of something's truly regenerative. And if we're not really in line, if we're taking more than we're giving, then we become really territorial, because
aware of scarcity.
Yeah. And that's very clear in a lot of indigenous Aboriginal peoples. Like they were not fighting us in the beginning because they were so aligned with the resources that they had, that they were like, yeah, we want, help us, like, let's do this together and create more. And they didn't totally understand where we were coming from at the time, or, where those people were coming from. So yeah, I think it's an interesting, like, localism and surfing it and looking at that through a regenerative lens is an interesting clue as to, maybe our surf culture now is taking more than it's giving. I don't know. I haven't thought about that.
That's good food for thought.
It's a funny one with surfing because in some lineups, waves are a limited resource, and yet waves are one of the truly infinite renewable resources on our planet.
Well, I feel like here in Oz, there's a very interesting sort of space opening up, and it almost tips back to, we were talking about mentors before, and when you have a space open up in your life where you perhaps need one appears, or you can start being a mentor for somebody else. And I feel like in the surfing world right now, there's a bit of a hole that has opened up due to the sort of the dissolving of the sway of the massive surf companies. They're all just consuming each other in the classic capitalist model, and mostly are losing their influence on large sections of people who participate in surfing. And likewise, especially here in Oz, there's been a lot of talk about just, the contest machine trying to keep itself alive and sort of flogging a dead horse in a way when it's, trying to get back on its feet and do all these events. And that a lot of people here don't really give a shit and have not missed that aspect of the surfing organism at all in the last year. And so it's almost like it's opened up a space where the megaphone shouting about hyper competitiveness and individualism and celebrity structures and all that has been turned down, and there's a bit more space for other conversations to perhaps come towards the front. And something that's been discussed here among a few circles is what are we going to fill that other space with? How can we start speaking with each other in ways that are perhaps more collaborative, less competitive, more joyful and inclusive. And, you know, right now there's discussions here with Indigenous communities and who surf, and their unbelievable depth of relationship to country here, and just perseverance, struggling with, you know, one of the most radical colonialist stories in the world here in Australia. And it's an exciting time in a lot of ways that there is a space here that's opening up for us to talk in new ways. And, you know, right now in Oz, we've got Surfing World magazine, which still prints quarterly here, whereas most of the print mirrors in the surfing organism have dissolved. But here, Surfing World has taken a really fresh angle of discussing all these kinds of things, all the efforts to really galvanize communities in order to look after the spaces that we inhabit and each other. And I was just wondering, is corduroy going to be something along those lines as well? Is there a voice there with that you're really hoping to share with other people? Is it going to have any surfing stuff related to it, or is it just going to be, you know, animal husbandry and growing plants?
Well, that's really awesome, Dave, to hear that, and that sounds like an exciting project. And yeah, I don't know. I think it's right now we're just kind of thinking about, you know, kind of sharing solutions for thriving in wild times, and like affordable and fun solutions, and that can include play like surfing, but it's also just going to look at a lot of that intersectional stuff where, you know, living small, living simple, enjoying human powered activities and things like that. But I think that, you know, our friend Lex Weinstein is working on sea and soil, and she's kind of doing some like gardening meetup get-togethers. And I think that there's people who are probably closer to the coast that can do some more of that stuff. But I think that's I don't know, maybe I'll think about that, Dave. Thanks.
Well, I'm sure your voice would be appreciated in that space of interpreting the surfing experience in very unique ways. Really valuable, especially, you know that feeling of that homogenization of surfing and all of that's just been steering the ship for so long. It just feels kind of exciting that there's not really anyone at that, and in fact we've all probably jumped off it and going all our own interesting ways.
I don't often use Wikipedia as a source of research anymore, thankfully, but I read on your Wikipedia page that your commercial clients include Adidas, Apple, Corona, Reef, Patagonia, and more. And you wrote recently that one of your 2021 resolutions was to only do business with companies who are operating with integrity. I'd love to hear a little more about what integrity means to you, what defines integrity in that context. Yeah, as a filmmaker and an entrepreneur, I was interested to hear you talk through the meaning and importance of B Corp for you.
B Corp is just their corporations that have a bottom line that isn't just a fiduciary responsibility to quarterly profits for shareholders. Like, it started with the Revlon case. I think it was in the 90s, where it really baked into, at least American, I assume Australian, just legalities around operating of businesses, that it just was sort of a profit at all costs. And so say you and I have a business idea and it's really beautiful and it could really help the world, but through these systems that exist, every quarter, the more people we get on board to make the resources happen to compete so that somebody else doesn't, do our idea with more access, we sort of like that vision is inherently eroded. So B Corp was started by these guys who was like, hey, what if we can write into the bylaws of companies, like an X Factor or something that, has people care and earth care in it, so that when we create a company and then, we want to sell it or grow it or we move on from it, that a Unilever or a Coca-Cola or some big multinational company can't just take it and, turn it back into something that is the same business as usual. And so I think their idea was like, okay, well, let's create smaller brands and even larger middle-sized brands like Waikiki and Patagonia and like New Belgium. Like, it's this idea of like, okay, well, if brands become bigger because they're doing the right thing, it's like this tragedy that they lose their soul when they get to a certain point. And let's actually change these bigger companies, because the bigger companies are consistently having to acquire smaller ones to keep their brands. And we've seen this in the surf industry, to keep their big multinationals, flowing. Well, oh, you bought that thing, but you actually can't fuck it up. It's got to have some of that original vision. And I think it really can combat greenwashing, because companies can do things a certain way. And all of us as consumers, or the majority of us, want a healthy planet for our kids. And so we're going to support companies that have a certain level of efficacy. And and I think, these big multinationals have kind of banked on the fact that they can capitalize on kind of behind the surface eroding that. So I just wanted to, work. I don't know if you guys have felt this, but I just think that if we set out an intention and we say we're going to do something, and we hold ourselves to a level of integrity, which for me means doing what you say, then opportunities arise. And if we don't have the faith or the will to kind of put it out there, then we don't, and we end up kind of going back into a safety mindset, which, I don't think we're here and we're alive to be safe. We're here to be on an adventure and to manifest the solutions to the ills we see in the world, because they're the opportunity for jumping off into the expanse.
I don't think many people would use such poetry to explain a question about companies and business ethics, but you do it really well, Rudder. And that's the kind of marrying, I guess, that's really required right now, is in all of these, ventures and things that might just be, cerebral or just physical or providing goods and services. They require that kind of, poetic and emotion in them and humanness to them. It's just, it's neat to hear you talk of that.
I really wanted to ask you about that, Cyrus, because it's been a real conversation between Dave and I with the podcast and using the advertising model and choosing which brands we want to work with. And I've sort of defaulted to, supporting B Corps primarily, and, that being a real gauge of something, at least. It's not a perfect system, but it's a system that at least gives us an indication of the sort of heart and intention and forward direction of a particular brand. So I find it really useful. And I found your short film really useful about it, to sort of explain for people who don't know what a B Corp is, what it is and why it's meaningful.
Yeah, I love, what Dr. Bronner says about how we see capitalism as being this inherently negative thing, when it's an energy exchange. It's a Darwinian energy exchange. And if our underlying health is extractive, if capitalism is existing within a colonialist framework where it's extractive, then it becomes problematic. But if we create an integrity around it, then we're, it's a structure of energy that isn't necessarily bad or good.
Yeah,
I think those words, like capitalism, colonialism, industrialism, they all spiral in our vernacular, and we talk about them, but I'm always I'm just fascinated with how they interplay and what mix of each one is creating the things that we're not happy with.
That's so useful. They do, those words really become sort of master signifiers of bad, move away from, retreat, abort. But that's not really a functional response for reforming and yet moving towards the systems that are regenerative and helpful and moving us forward in new definitions of success and progress, like we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I think that everything kind of what we've been talking about is seeing the world in a way that the problem, permaculture talk goes, the problem is the solution. All these challenges we're living with today are a great calling to live an alive life. You know, if everything was just hunky-dory, I don't know, it wouldn't be as interesting, you know, but there's really big problems and there's really amazing potential, you know.
And we're being invited to ask those big questions and rise to our own new potentials through the, gosh, it feels like the cascade of crises that we get to grapple with in our lifetime.
Yeah, sometimes it feels a little intense, no?
It does. It definitely does. It definitely, I know it makes me want to retreat and just dive underwater.
I know you got mad at me last time for asking you a question, but since we're like both
that wasn't mad.
Another long,
I was giving you space.
I'm so fascinated about your take on surfing moving forward and what feels like a regenerative surfing experience to you.
Yes, Lauren, tell me.
That was right to you.
Or Lauren, yeah, obviously. Like, what do you guys think?
Well, Lauren, you just have written a book and are diving into the women's branch of the surfing tree. You got any thoughts on that straight up?
Well, I'm studying through my permaculture design course right now. And so something that comes up for me immediately with that question, Cyrus, are the guiding ethics of permaculture, the three foundational ethics: earth care, people care, and return of surplus. And I think we would do well as a culture to have more conversations about what our guiding ethics are. Maybe we can pull them from permaculture, but there are lots of other thought systems that would work well in the coastal space. And that's where most of the value is for me right now, is just opening up dialogue to have real conversations about local, regionally adapted surfing cultures and what surfing means and you know, to individual communities, because we've had a dominant narrative, a colonialist white Western perspective that's been adopted or enforced or forced upon surfing cultures all over the world. And so I'm just excited to see, these regionally adapted versions come to life more and more. And it feels like a really exciting time for surfing right now, with the erosion of our mainstream media and the brands maybe feeling a bit tired and disconnected from the reality of the surfing experience, for all of these new dreams and ideas to bubble to the surface into what makes sense at the community level.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I love like the idea of talking about the bathymetry and how it, you know, catches the swells and makes these waves that we're riding and gives them the character, and then how that bathymetry flows up onto the land and creates watersheds and hydrology conversations. That sounds super fun.
Yeah, well, there's definitely nothing I can say after that'll be so eloquent. So yeah, Lauren, I completely agree with what you just said. Well, you know, I've always felt that surfing is a very personal experience that we have alongside each other, in almost personal in a public space, and that there's tension in that, because we're all explaining this thing as though what everyone else is experiencing when they ride waves is the same thing that we are experiencing, but it's just so specific to each and every wave, even, let alone a session, let alone a season, let alone a life. And so just that personal nature, and also for me, quite recently spending more time with some Indigenous surfing buddies here and just speaking how surfing fits in to a real relationship with country and your life with other people. It's really powerful, and it's really personal. And jokingly, a lot of the times I just refer to surfing in a way like sex, you know, like talking about it is just, it doesn't feel anywhere near as good as actually doing it. And it's never an accurate, really. You can't wrap tiny words around such a big experience. So, and surfing often feels that way. And we know that when we see, you know, people's attempts to wrap up the surfing experience in Hollywood films or films that come from people who aren't close to the surfing experience. But at the very least, when we have mirrors and means to look at the experience through print media, through things on screens, through sound waves, through our earphones or whatever, the least we can do is mirror one of the great principles of thriving life, and that's diversity. And I feel like that perhaps right now that's looking better and better and better for the surfing organism. There's so much more diversity now than there ever has been, in my opinion. There are so many women in the water. There are so many intergenerational
I would add
relationships.
In modern surfing, the modern surfing timeline.
Yeah, modern, yeah. And it's just, that's neat, you know. There's something about that that is, like Lauren said, really exciting.
I love that. I remember surfing with Jeff Lawton out in the pass once, and he was telling me that, you know, surfers are pattern readers, and that, you know, the way, in particular, somebody like both of you guys on the waves, it's like, seems like you guys are having more of a conversation when you surf, you know, and it's like you're better surfers are able to, like, you guys are able to like anticipate a little bit in advance of what a wave's going to do, because you've seen patterns and then what they do before, so that you can deduce sort of what's going to happen next. Or you know, you can look at the bottom of a wave and see how it's going to maybe cup out and dry out and then turn into a certain kind of a lip line, and or how it's going to either like bend into the point and what that's going to do, or it starts to fan out and what that's going to do. And it seems like that's at the core of what's important for us to take on Earth, is like a sense of pattern literacy on the land, and tapping into that vibration of just being in conversation with life, you know. And I think that's one of the ironic things about surfing that is a really, I remember in my, you know, development or getting better at surfing, I thought, you know, you want the result, you want to surf like somebody like yourselves, or you want to, and yet that graspiness and that desire to do so oftentimes holds so many of us back as surfers. And until we realize that, whoa, it's really a curiosity that keeps somebody coming back into the ocean and receiving feedback, and then a dedication to it to the point where there's enough hours and enough observation. And I don't know if you guys have witnessed this or seen this as a commonality between some of the best surfers, but they really take notes about life. They're fascinated with the details, and there is that exchange and that this wanting to assimilate information and learning. And I think, you know, a lot of us who are just trying to get somewhere or get a result, we overlook that. And that's something I think surfing is really, and permaculture and being, you know, productive on the land and creating surplus and fair share is like, that's really what it requires too, is it requires a real commitment and attentiveness and care for systems that are flowing around us.
Thanks to Cyrus for his commitment to going deep and wide with complex questions and creative projects. Special thanks always to our sound engineer and in-house musician, Shannon Sol Carroll. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thanks for making the time to listen with us. If you have a spare moment, please consider leaving a review of the podcast or sharing an episode with a friend. Both help us to keep the podcast going and to find the very best stories from our global community of water people. We'll be continuing today's conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find every episode and some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.